Good evening, and welcome to episode 76 of the Political Mike podcast. We've got a lot to go over this week. We've got, for instance, Hurricane Ian, which has already made landfall in Florida and is now making its way up through the southeastern part of the United States, that has already taken many lives and destroyed property. Many wonder how the working relationship between President Biden and Governor DeSantis has been amidst this trying time for many Americans. We also have a conservative legal group challenging the Biden administration's move to forgive $10,000 of student debt for those who did not receive a Pell Grant and $20,000 for those who did receive a Pell Grant. Again, we're going to also be dealing with the amount that the Democratic Party, the DNC, has invested in Secretary of State's races across the country. And finally, Vladimir Putin's desperate attempt to recruit more soldiers as the battle between Ukraine and Russia over Ukraine's sovereignty wages on. Here to help me delve into all of these complex issues are another unique group of scholars, and I'm glad to have them on tonight. So we have Mr. Jerry Ford, of course, no guest of Political Mike. He's a private equity and M&A associate at Sidley Austin LLP. He's a graduate of Howard University School of Law and received a master's degree in public policy from the University of Houston. Before attending law school, Jerry hosted a daily talk show on KJOZ 880 AM in Texas, and he has made numerous television appearances on Fox 26 News and KHOU 11 as a political commentator. So, Jerry, thanks for being on tonight. We also have Tia Toombs, who is attending Oakwood University, majoring in pre-law. Ms. Toombs is a young advocate and leader in her community. In recent years, she served as the 28th Miss Oakwood University and president of the Oakwood NAACP chapter. So, Tia, thanks for being back on. Zach Tolan, who received his Juris Doctorate earlier this year from Howard University School of Law. Born and raised in Allentown, Pennsylvania, he spent much of his youth pursuing opportunities to discuss political, social justice, and moral and philosophical issues. Upon graduating from high school, he was awarded the National Society of the Sons of the American Revolution, Valley Forge Chapter, Bronze Good Citizenship Medal based on the qualities of dependability, cooperation, leadership, and patriotism. He also majored in political science, where he attended at George Washington University, where he earned a Bachelor's of Arts, majoring in history and minoring in creative writing and political science. He was inducted into the Phi Beta Kappa Society. So, Zach, thanks for being a part of this week's episode and making time. We're also going to be joined by Nate Honore, of course, who's become a regular face at this point, who graduated from Quinnipiac University School of Law. He's also a brilliant mind, who's well astute in matters of public policy. I'm glad to have his insight today. And we're also going to be joined with by Ismail Ibrahim, who is a Black American Muslim who was born and raised on the south side of Chicago, Illinois. He is also a recent graduate of Howard University School of Law and is scheduled to begin, well, he is practicing, I should say, as an associate at a law firm in Chicago. He worked for the Investor Justice and Education Clinic during his time at Howard Law, and the scope of his work and his new firm is centered around the capital markets and finance generally. So, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to dive right in. Being that, the hurricane has already escalated to a Category 1. First of all, Hurricane Ian's vicious combination of winds, rain, and storm surge caused at least a dozen deaths, flooded houses, cut off roadways, and left millions of Floridians without power today, as it again intensified into a hurricane in the Atlantic Ocean and barreled toward South Carolina. In addition to that, Ian made landfall Wednesday afternoon in southwest Florida and was downgraded to a tropical storm, dropping heavy rain on central and northeast Florida throughout Thursday and Wednesday. But it intensified into Category 1, a Category 1 hurricane Thursday afternoon, and is forecasted to make a second landfall in South Carolina on Friday tomorrow. In southwest and central Florida, at least 15 people were reported dead. Now, President Joe Biden today has praised the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, for its response to Hurricane Ian, telling the room full of FEMA workers that they're restoring America's faith in their government. Biden stopped to speak to the workers after attending the FEMA briefing on the hurricane's devastation in Florida. And he said that over the past 6 to 10 years, faith in government institutions has been eroding. He said, quote, "You are reinforcing people's faith in institutions." And he said that at the FEMA headquarters today. Now, during Biden's first year in office, he signed an executive order aimed at this priority, making it easier for Americans to renew passports, apply for Social Security, and receive aid after facing natural disasters. The idea of being able to put public interest and customer service at the center of government operations seems to be something at the forefront of the agenda of this administration. Asked Thursday about his calls with GOP Governor Ron DeSantis, Biden brushed off the divergent politics and rhetorical sparring between the two men that have escalated in recent weeks ahead of November's midterm elections. I want to open up the floor for discussion on how the Biden administration and the governor Ron DeSantis administration has handled the situation in Florida thus far, in your opinion.
Yeah, Mike, I can jump in right here. Look, I'm very intimately, have a close relationship with hurricanes. Unfortunately, being from Houston, Hurricane Rita, Ike, even Katrina had a major impact, especially on the Texas Gulf Coast. This is a situation, when you're dealing with these type of natural disasters where, you have, your local government, your city council, or your mayor, then maybe your county, and also your state governments all having to work together, and then also with the federal government. So it's one of the rare times where you kind of see politics kind of being put aside for the time being. It looks like what's happening in Florida right now is they're working together with the state governments. FEMA is there. I think in the past, especially around Katrina, when George W. Bush was in office, there was a slow reaction to Katrina. Some of the hurricanes, but it looks like we've learned from past hurricanes. I know Florida is probably very used to hurricanes coming every single season. So far, it looks like things are going well when you're talking about government cooperation, but the victims of this hurricane, it's pretty tough situation that's happening right now.
And just for the record, before we even got to this part of the week, the headlines were Biden and DeSantis have not cooperated or spoken to each other at all. And that changed, of course, early this morning, yesterday, when news broke out that Biden and DeSantis have been on the phone and been in communication. DeSantis, of course, thanked Biden for approving their pre-landfall declaration. He also acknowledged that the administration wants to help what seems to be a very dangerous storm. Biden said, I made it clear to the governor and the mayors that the federal government is ready to help in every single way possible. He said we'll be there every step of the way. And this is very reminiscent of 10 years ago, in my view, when you had Obama and Chris Christie. And that was also during a period right before a crucial election. And for the most part, the bipartisanship that was occurring between the two of them seemed to benefit both Christie and Obama. I don't think that Christie really came out of that situation in a negative light among his party at the time. Of course, by the time we get to 2016, the Washington Bridge, everything, the New Jersey Bridge, and all that happened in between that time and his bid for president. There was some stains then, but I don't think anything happened at that moment to really deter Christie from continuing to work with Obama. And I think it actually would be to his advantage, especially Ron DeSantis, who himself is looking to be reelected in a few weeks. People want to know if there's a steady hand at the helm. And right now, it seems as if working with Biden potentially would be to his benefit. Now, I will say it is hypocritical to me how he could make press conferences and seem to be the responsible adult in the room after calling Dr. Fauci a little elf and saying he wants to chuck him across the room. And that was that was about a public servant who only wanted to ensure that the United States gets out of a health crisis, COVID-19. But that aside, I do think that DeSantis working with Biden is a good thing. Anyone else?
I'm actually in Florida right now. I'm in Jacksonville, and we've been working through the storm. It's not as bad as Tampa, but it's looking like everything is going to be okay since, it's veering a little bit away from us. But I think in regards to Governor DeSantis, I think he realizes that these are the types of things that can affect you politically. Recession, inflation, and natural disasters. if you're unlucky enough to be in office when these things happen, even if you respond in the proper ways, it could cost you re-election, and he knows that. So that's why he's welcoming President Biden, helping him. He realizes, maybe now is not the time to play these political games. And I just find it actually very ironic because when he was in the House of Representatives representing my very own district, the sixth district of Florida, he voted against giving help to New Jersey and New York when a tropical storm Sandy hit. So, it's just all coming back full circle for him. And we'll see how it affects him politically because, he does like to focus on the stunts, sending migrants from Texas to Martha's Vineyard. Those things don't really look well, politically for someone like me. When I'm going to be affected with a hurricane, what I notice is as soon as we heard the hurricanes were going to hit us, the stores were sold out of water, bread, even peanut butter and jelly, toilet paper. Those are the types of things that citizens in these communities we notice. And I would hope that, water and bread is being given out for free as a response in, places like Tampa, who were known to be hit more harder than, us on the east side of Florida. But you just never know. Like, the communication just isn't there from his administration. He could be doing well, but someone like me isn't really seeing that. And, who knows how it's going to turn out for him, but he sure does love his press conferences.
And the Biden administration and DeSantis have worked together before. I remember last year when there was a disaster, not an actual disaster, but there was a level of cooperation when it came down to a building that had collapsed, a condo building in the Surfside collapsed last year, killing 98 people. And then the president traveled to Florida and was met with praise from DeSantis during a visit where the two men sat side by side at a briefing. Of course, DeSantis is a likely 2024 challenger. He's been the one name consistently brought up in polling after polling who could potentially be an anti-Trump. But he has repeatedly said he's focusing on his upcoming reelection. And when asked if he's running for president, of course, he's deferred to his current campaign. Biden placed his hand on DeSantis's right arm, and the Republican governor praised the cooperation at the local, state, and federal level. So there's a lot of imagery that comes into play. What's also interesting is that Rick Scott, who is the chair of the senatorial campaign for the GOP, has also expressed praise for the federal government's handling of the hurricane. That aside, the current show of bipartisan cooperation, do you think that this is undermined by recent tension between the White House and the governor's mansion in Florida over the sending of migrants to Martha's Vineyard, like Tia mentioned?
Go ahead, Zach.
Well, Mike, actually, you stole my thunder. I was hoping to make that reference back to Chris Christie because it was the first thing that popped into my mind as well. But to your question here about, I'm not sure that I would say that this cooperation is undermined by that stunt. I feel like that stunt was rather undermined by this cooperation because it's just like what happened with Chris Christie. It's that thing that happens when a huge natural disaster goes on. I want to give DeSantis some credit. I think he does care in his own way about his Florida. So when he's seeing support from the federal government coming down to help, hit people for something that he believes in, COVID wasn't one of those things, but a big natural disaster, it's kind of hard to argue that there isn't really a crisis going on when a hurricane makes landfall. It's tough to argue against that kind of footage. I want to give him credit for that. I think he is truly, appreciating that. But frankly, it seems to me to be sort of undermining the political message he's trying to get out there of screwing with Biden when he has to turn around a second later and say, he's actually doing a great job here. But I did notice that he's not really complimenting him on anything other than the specific assistance to Florida that he is benefiting from. So I noted that as well.
I just want to add really quick. My experience with hurricanes, there's not, like, when it comes to hurricane preparedness, there's not much you can do besides the basic level, state legislator and mayors, making sure that there's infrastructure in those communities, that each neighborhood has proper drainage, that making sure building codes are up to date to withstand the extreme weather conditions. Those are the types of things that are considered, everyday hurricane preparedness. And I will say, Governor DeSantis doesn't really get much credit in my book because his predecessors kind of already put those things in place because we deal with these things every year. So it's kind of just like he took the aid when he needed it, and I appreciate that. The federal government is always willing to help. So during times like these, I think what we really need for hurricane preparedness is strong leadership. And I do say that he likes to portray that, and he is portraying the strong leadership that we need right now. I would hope that that continues, and there's nothing like paper towels being thrown at displaced residents. And we're lucky enough to be in the incorporated mainland because people in Puerto Rico might not get the same aid that we do because Congress refuses to, give them funds for infrastructure. So, I mean, in regards to giving him props, I don't want to give him too much because, we deal with this constantly. But I will say that the strong leadership is there.
I do just want to qualify. I didn't mean to give him props. I was giving him credit in that I think he is legitimately saying he is thankful for the work that the federal government has done. I don't think he was, just throwing that out there for political points. I do believe that he truly appreciated it. I'm not saying that I give him credit for the work that has been done on Florida's government behalf.
Interestingly, on the press conferences, I see like local leaders, local people in power. They don't like to really thank Biden. I noticed that they've been thanking Governor DeSantis, so I just think that's really funny to me.
Yeah, Mike, if I can say something real quick, I think like Tia, you just made a really good point because most of these decisions are actually, around, the hurricane preparation is really around like your mayor and your like maybe your county officials, right? Mm-hmm. So the state government, they're not really making these decisions on like to evacuate, citizens from cities. That's going to be your mayor of Tampa, your mayor of if there's a hurricane in Miami, where like which facilities will be held as shelters, like which big sports facilities, if it's a basketball arena or maybe like a baseball field where you're going to bring in a lot of people who could not evacuate. Like all the decisions are going to be your local government officials and your county officials with the assistance of your state government, and that assistance really is going to be funds, right? So most of these press conferences that you see, if there's a hurricane in Florida, it's a hurricane in Louisiana, or in Texas, is going to be your mayor who's going to be at the forefront of it, and then your governor is really going to be there just as like support and really just this funding mechanism, which is why you will see these mayors, not say anything negative about DeSantis, right? You might have a very progressive mayor, who might, have disagreements with DeSantis, but is being kind of deferential to him in the same way that DeSantis is treating the federal government, right? It's really because, they need money from the federal government for aid, and the local governments need money from the state government. So.
And to speak to your point, Mike, as a Long Islander who was around for Sandy, it did actually have massive ramifications on that year's presidential campaign. In fact, Obama's response to Sandy was considered so strong that Mitt Romney's campaign blamed it on their election loss because they felt that Obama was, pretty much coming down like an angel from above to give the aid and the comfort and all of that. And, Chris Christie, who was already, any national aspirations Chris Christie had were already severely limited by the fact that he portrayed himself as a moderate governor in a blue state. But him eagerly embracing and thanking Obama for his help didn't help things either. But as far as this response, I would say it's too early to call as far as the federal government and the state government's response to Hurricane Ian. It's not just, how we respond to the devastation and how much the federal government and its leadership is willing to show up. Florida is in the middle of an insurance crisis, right? Like a whole bunch of major insurance companies are pulling out of Florida, meaning most Floridians who have homeowners insurance are using the state's insurance program. So what is the response to that going to be as people try to rebuild their lives after, a devastating hurricane has taken place? And more than just that, hurricane preparedness also deals, at least in some aspect in this day and age, with how we respond to climate change. Because as the weather fluctuates more and more, as ocean temperatures rise, as water levels increase because of the melting ice caps, these hurricanes get stronger and stronger. So we need a strong response to rising temperatures, or rather fluctuating temperatures, that not only addresses the effects of the problem, hurricane devastation in Florida and in Puerto Rico, but also the causes, which thankfully we did just get through the bill that Joe Biden just signed, the Inflation Reduction Act. But, that's where, Democrats need to not just be governing, but also be their own salespeople. Now, like Tia said, we can't just focus only on Florida. Puerto Rico is an American territory and they have been devastated. Puerto Ricans are suffering from lack of access to electricity, running water. And we have seen the last time Puerto Rico was hit by a major hurricane, how the federal government basically left Puerto Ricans for dead. So we need to see just as much as Biden is going to Tallahassee and shaking DeSantis' hand, he needs to do the same thing down in San Juan. Now with the migrant situation, or fiasco really, that is going on, where DeSantis is using taxpayer dollars to, effectively kidnap people and send them across state lines. I'm not sure how Biden showing up, how the president or the head of the federal government showing up in a crisis necessarily undermines the face-off between the two on immigration, but how Biden handles himself here, like we were talking about earlier with Christie, is going to determine DeSantis' viability in 2024. Because no matter what the polls say, Trump is still a very strong candidate. He won in 2016. He won the primary in 2016 with about 45% of the vote. So if DeSantis runs, but also Mike Pence and Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and Nikki Haley and everybody else, Trump can still win with 40% of the vote because of the way the Republican primary process is structured. So how Biden himself handles himself here, how big of a leadership role he takes, and personal, individual, retail, handshaking politics has always been Biden's specialty. How he does that here and how DeSantis responds determines his viability for 2024.
And to that point, Nate, you know what amazes me? The fact that Newsweek this week, or a little bit last week, reported that a national poll showed that a plurality of Hispanic voters. Now, remember, last week's headline was not Hurricane Ian. Last week's headline was the stunt that Governor DeSantis pulled. Not just Governor DeSantis, but Governor DeSantis in cooperation with Governor Abbott, in cooperation with Governor Ducey in Arizona. It showed a plurality of Hispanic voters supporting the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis' move to relocate migrants from the U.S.-Mexico border to sanctuary cities, and what political strategists called a sign that once reliably liberal demographic is gravitating towards the GOP. I mean, this is... I always rack my brain. I've had Chris Matthews on. I've had other guests on, and I always ask, and no one really came up to an adequate answer that really can convey how this just seems to stand the test of time. And that is, why is it that the Latino vote seems to be reliably Republican, even when it's against its own interest? I mean, you're seeing your brothers and sisters being shipped. I mean, for African Americans, I'm saying this in response to George Floyd, right, in 2020. We saw Black Lives Matter mobilizing and taking over the summer of 2020, that momentum just carrying into the general election season. I don't understand why it is that the Latino populace is not responding in kind. That's just, that aside, was also interesting. Go ahead.
We in America tend to view Hispanic voters as a monolith, right? They all speak the same language and have similar names, but they're not a monolith and never have been.
No, but when you
Voters
vote,
from Cuba have different interests and vote for different reasons than voters in New York. So voters in Cuba who tend to be refugees, Castro refugees who fled communism, tend to be very skeptical of things that even vaguely resemble socialism, and class education-wise tend to come from the backgrounds that would traditionally vote conservative. And not to mention that Latin America as a whole is culturally conservative. But different cultural groups have different, electoral priorities. And, not to mention, many of us on this program can kind of understand something. But when you're kind of forced into an other position, into the status of an other cultural, racial class, and someone else does something that is now being used to brand all of you, there is a natural instinct to distance yourself from it. So even though most of the Cubans in Florida, or at least a very good chunk, I don't want to be extreme and say most, have benefited from generous immigration policies like wet foot, dry foot, which say that if you're caught, or rather, if you manage to find yourself, on the U.S. side of the U.S.-Cuba maritime border by the time the Coast Guard finds you, you're granted asylum, or at least if you manage to get on physical U.S. soil, they still want to see other Hispanics take the legal, proper way to attain citizenship and residency in this country, just so that the whole community doesn't have to deal with the stigma of being perceived as people who snuck in. Of course, that's never going to change. We're all familiar with how this society functions, but that's the natural instinct. So voters, the Hispanic community in Florida is overwhelmingly Cuban and Venezuelan, and it's similar for both. So, they have different priorities, and the Democratic Party being very slow to realize that Hispanic voters are not the monolith they treat them as, and that voters in Florida are not, Hispanics in Florida are not Hispanics in the Southwest, and they're not Hispanics in the Midwest, and they're not Hispanics in the Northeast, is why we're seeing that Democrats are slowly losing what was a firewall constituency for them.
I also wanted to mention the comparison with Trump's handling of Maria. I think Tia alluded to it a little bit earlier. The Trump White House, it's important to note, in 2018, made few preparations in the lead up to the storm. And it was, I'm sorry, I said 2017. And it was weeks before the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, committed its full resources to Puerto Rico. And during that time, clean water was scarce, food was hard to find, hospitals struggled to care for patients, some of which had patients with serious injuries and illnesses. Most of Puerto Rico lacked electricity for months. I remember, this is Congressional Black Caucus legislative week. I was an intern at the time, or a little bit after the hurricane hit, and they had a panel, and they were sharing just some of the horrific things that were going on. You had hospitals having to decide which patients were going to live because they didn't have enough resources to allocate towards everyone. So most of Puerto Rico lacked electricity for months. Medical supplies were few and far between. And when FEMA did eventually act, it dropped the ball, right? And so we saw also there was a political consequence of that. Trump's approval rating drops 20 points after that situation happened. Jerry, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, well, I wanted to add on to, the conversation about, Hispanic voters not being a monolithic. Like when you look at, the Cuban voters in Miami, that makes so much sense, right? You just escape the most nasty, dirtiest side of, dictatorship, and you've seen the worst of communism and socialism. So when you come to this country, you're most likely going to, probably be a little more conservative. But I think other than, Florida, I think you also are seeing this in Texas, where you are seeing maybe 35-40% of Hispanic voters who are voting, more conservative, who voting Republican, right? So there's always been this conversation the last, couple of years about, is Texas, will ever turn blue? And, that rationale was, well, there's this big increase in Latino, voters in Texas. But what most Democrats didn't anticipate was the fact that 35% of those voters were going to vote for the Republican. And what you see in Texas is, you have a large segment of probably Catholic, middle class type Hispanic voters who probably came over legally, right? So they're more conservative because of their religion, and then also they're saying, look, I stood in line and I went through this process, and so you have that kind of dynamics going back and forth, right? And just like Black voters in this country, we're not monolithic, right? The Black voters in the Midwest might vote a little differently than the Black voters in the South, right? We see that during the primary, the Democratic primary in particular. So that's saying that's the same thing across most different races, right? So I don't think we can say just because you are Latino that you should vote Democrat. I mean, I think Democrats need to explain the reason why our agenda is best suited for you, for your family. So
right, I agree with the messaging point, Jerry. And I say this because my mom's side, and I know just by looking at me, folks would just assume I'm just Black all the way, but I do have Venezuelan family on my mom's side, and my dad's Costa Rican. And I say this because I have family who fled Venezuela 2 years ago to go to Trinidad, where my grandmother lives, to live there. And just looking at the fact that you're so used to socialism and communism, and that aside, look at how this party has dealt with FEMA. Just a little over 10 years ago, back in 2011, right? You had 11 Republican U.S. senators who represent states with the most FEMA declared disasters since the start of 2009, voting against a bill designed to keep FEMA's disaster relief fund from running out of cash. Now we see the importance. Times like these allow us to see the importance and how crucial an organization like FEMA is. But going back, I mean, this is the party that wanted to defund FEMA, right? And would it be as effective today in handling Hurricane Ian, Hurricane Maria, other hurricanes, right? Yes, we've seen disasters. We've seen property loss. We've seen lives lost. Imagine how much more that damage would have amplified if the Republicans had their way in defunding, right, FEMA. So I want to put that out there. We have to be critical voters regardless of demographic, I believe. And I do believe that the Democratic Party does owe or bear some responsibility in the way it messages. But I also believe that the voters have a responsibility in actually thinking critically, right? If you don't want to be a monolith, fine, don't vote like a monolith. Think critically. What has this party done? What has this party provided for me in recent years for me to actually commit my vote to this party? Tia?
Yeah, I was going to say, with my experience politically with the Hispanic community, we have a lot of Mexicans in our community. And I will say that they are very resilient and very strong people. And that reflects in how they vote, especially sometimes voting against their own community's interests. If they've been in the country, if they've been born in America, I noticed that, some Mexican business owners, they relate a lot more with the Republican platform because they are business owners and they do care about taxes. And, but on the other hand, they have the same people that they're voting for, sending their brothers and sisters, kidnapping them across state lines. So that I think it is Democrats' responsibility to show them how we can give you the things that, can benefit you politically and also treat you decently, like the human being that you deserve to be treated as.
And Mike, I wanted to jump in here and say that it's interesting the point you raised about Republicans not voting to fund FEMA, and I'm not sure if there was a alternative policy in mind as to how to treat disasters outside of FEMA. But it's not just the Republican Party who wants to defund organizations that they or agencies that they feel like don't really bring as much value as they do cost. So such the Democratic Party consistently mentions abolishing ICE, but it's not, and then they're not mentioning to abolish ICE because they don't want any kind of immigration policy. They just want a different immigration policy. So I just don't want us to act like there is no alternative ways outside of funding these extremely large federal bureaucracies. So, and the Democrats obviously agree with that when it comes to ICE. So Republicans, when it comes to FEMA and these large, behemoths of public funding, is that the most efficient way to handle these issues? Because at the end of the day, no one's against disaster responding and saving lives. But a lot of people are against, just glutton the budget and wasteful, wasting taxpayers' dollars.
Yeah,
Well,
and
I'm not quite sure that's the same, reasoning, right? Like, ICE abolition has never been a part of the major party platform. Nobody in party leadership has ever endorsed ICE abolition. Not Joe Biden, not Nancy Pelosi, not Chuck Schumer, not Jim Clyburn, and not Steny Hoyer. AOC is not in leadership. She's a highly influential Democrat, but she doesn't set the party's platform.
But we are talking about politics, though, and like abolishing ICE is something that gained a lot of steam among, you can call it the young Democrats.
AOC does not set the Democratic Party's policy agenda.
So we can voters will. So voters
about what's on Twitter, but Twitter is a microcosm of reality. If Twitter was a projection of real life, we'd be talking about President Sanders and Vice President Warren. But that's not who we ended up seeing as the party's nominees. The Republican Party's view on FEMA is more than just small budgets, which no one actually cares about because, Trump ran up historic deficits and nobody said a word. But, which, once again, the only people who actually care about deficits are Democrats. But it's more about the general Republican view about needing to snip away portions of the federal government because they don't believe in a large federal government, right? If you don't think the government works, then all you have to do to make people see your point is make the government not work, and then people will say, wow, the government doesn't work. So, when you're supporting that premise, this is how we get there. When FEMA is cash-strapped and hamstrung, people will say, and is not able to do what it's designed to do, people start to wonder, what is the point of FEMA if they cannot address, or adequately perform disaster relief when we experience these devastating natural disasters?
Yeah, and to be fair, Mike, beginning of this conversation, we talked about how with these hurricanes, is really dealt at a local level and a state level. So a lot of these conversations about, kind of defunding FEMA is not just coming out of conservative camps. There's a discussion that's happening, with Democrats. It is not, just getting rid of this money. It's like, hey, how about we give this money to these states in the Gulf Coast, right? So they can prepare ahead of time instead of, us waiting for something to happen and then saying, oh, hurricane happened 2 days ago. Now let us, let the funds, to your state. How about we give them the funds now and let them prepare? Because every hurricane season, if you are in Texas, Louisiana, all the way across to Florida, you have to be prepared for a hurricane at any moment. So instead of us having this agency and putting all our money into FEMA, how about we give money ahead of time to DeSantis or to the mayor in Houston or New Orleans? So that comes with a lot more nuance. I think the issue, then becomes when we look at Puerto Rico, where their infrastructure locally isn't as strong as, the infrastructure, in like the mainland, right? So that is where FEMA can actually do the most good. The federal government can do the most good when you have, a local government that isn't as strong. But then, the question becomes, well, why aren't we also funneling money to Puerto Rico in the same way we are giving money to Florida and to Texas and to Louisiana? So I think it's a little more nuanced. So I don't think it's really fair to say, that, people saying defund FEMA is actually, I think there's like a lot of merit to that discussion.
So I do want to switch gears a little bit, that's being that time is running away from us. But this past Tuesday, a conservative legal group sued to block the Biden administration from canceling large amounts of outstanding federal student loan debt for tens of millions of Americans, bringing the first major legal challenge to a policy that's expected to be litigated extensively. The lawsuit was filed by the Pacific Legal Foundation, and it argues the administration's plan to provide most federal student loan borrowers with up to $10,000 or $20,000 of debt relief amounts to an illegal abuse of authority. The plaintiff is Frank Garrison, an attorney who works at the foundation, who says he is in line to automatically receive $20,000 under the plan, but he argues he'll be left worse off by the Biden administration's debt relief because it will trigger state income taxes where he lives in Indiana. And Indiana is one of several states that has indicated its plans to impose a state tax on the amount of loan forgiveness. Most other states and the federal government will not treat Biden's loan forgiveness as a taxable income. Garrison argues the the Biden administration's debt relief program would force him to pay state income tax that he would otherwise be able to avoid. He says he's working towards having his federal student loans forgiven under a separate federal program, the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, within the next several years. The lawsuit argues that the Biden administration lacks the power to enact the sweeping debt relief program on its own without congressional approval. So I want to ask you, being that most of us here have been exposed to the law in one way or the other, most of us have been students of the law, do you believe that there's some merit to Garrison's argument that the Biden administration stepped out of bounds, that they were abusing its power in its actions to forgive this portion of student debt for millions of Americans?
Mike, can you clarify quickly? So the argument is that the student loan forgiveness will trigger this state income, the state tax.
Well, that's why
he's harmed.
That's an impact, but the main argument is that it falls outside the scope of executive authority, and that's really what they're arguing. It seems to be really much of a constitutional issue, being that Congress didn't give its approval according to this argument, and therefore this executive action exceeded the scope of the powers of the president as given by Article 2 of the Constitution. I think that's the crux of what this argument is. And the fact that state law taxes have been triggered just seems to be a side effect of the executive power overstepping its boundaries. According to the argument.
Well, I mean, if I may, I think that the state tax law issue is a desperate, excuse me, some kind of desperate attempt to create standing, because when you think about it, if he's complaining that he's going to be harmed by paying taxes on effectively $20,000 worth of income, that is less than having to pay back $20,000 ultimately on his pocketbook. So either way, he's not actually really being harmed. I think he's just coming up with some kind of excuse. As we all know, standing is hell. So he's coming up with some kind of harm to get through that illusion requirements. As far as the constitutional issue, we got that Youngstown question of, is it Twilight? Is it? I think arguably there is potentially a point there in that you could call that appropriations or directing funds that Congress has not directed in a particular area, or he's through this process of canceling, it's affecting funds to the government, and that is technically Congress's purview. I think that's shaky, and frankly, more to the point, I don't understand why, if he's truly concerned for some reason about this state tax, he doesn't complain to his state, as opposed to the federal government, which, if his problem is that he'd be suffering state taxes, which again would be ultimately less on his pocketbook than paying back these loans anyway, it seems odd to me that the strategy is rather than lobby or sue your state, saying that you can't tax this because it's not proper for taxation, or just lobby and say please don't because it'd be bad for all of us, as opposed to going towards the federal government and trying to say, not only do I not want $20,000 of debt wiped out, I also don't want anyone else to get that, because that makes more sense.
Yeah. I'm jump in real quick, and and this is my first time hearing this argument, but if this was automatic, right? Like I can see, because the question is standing, right? Is he harmed by this action? And if the forgiveness was automatic, then yes, he would have standing there because it's triggered the state tax. But you guys know, this isn't mandatory, right? So you can opt in or decide not to apply for the forgiveness. I think because of
that's part of the problem
there will be no, so he won't be harmed because he's not being forced, right? It's because there is a choice, saying, okay, you can apply for this forgiveness, right? Therefore, you can avoid this harm of this state income tax. So I think the Biden administration probably thought that through, which is why it's not meant automatic. So everybody automatically be forgiven $10,000. You have that option to opt in or not opt in, and that will defeat that argument that he is harmed by this state tax. because it's not being mandatory.
Sorry, if I can respond. So I'm not sure. I know that they quietly announced changes to the plan today, and I'm not actually up with all of what they did there, so I don't know if that changes anything. But I believe the argument that this lawyer is it Indiana? Yeah, I believe the argument he's making is that he was in a class that would be automatically forgiven. Correct me if I'm wrong there, but I think that was where he was.
Right. And even as it pertains to the separation of powers issue, when you look at FAFSA, which is that's the part of the United States Department of Education, which is the largest provider of student federal aid. Of course, the U.S. Department of Education is an executive agency, right? So even if you want to make that argument that this was something that should have been under the purview of Congress or had Congress's approval before the president acted, the fact that the majority of student loan grants come from this executive agency, to me, is something that the Biden administration's legal team would definitely hit home with and say, listen, even if your argument is that we're exceeding the scope of our authority, FAFSA really falls under the executive scope, really.
Well,
when you look at
it, Mike, it's an executive agency.
By Congress. Like all of that was inside of a statute. The issue with what Biden is doing is it's hard to find a place for it in that statute. He's acting unilaterally in a position that I think the legality of this question is likely extremely complicated. So just knowing my limited understanding of law and understanding what happened, I'm slightly leaning towards this action being a more ultra vires, being outside of the power that the president has, because he's unilaterally choosing to appropriate a huge sum of the U.S. government's money without any say to Congress. So like that's already an issue. And Joe Biden, someone who historically has wielded so much power over America's financial legislation coming from Delaware, being someone who fought so hard for the credit card companies, I'm not sure what his stance was initially on not being able to allow student loans into bankruptcy. But for me, that's the larger question that begs the point. Why aren't we just trying to include student loans in bankruptcy? What is all of this? Because that will subsume the need for forgiveness. Because if someone's in need of forgiveness, I mean they can't handle the burden of the credit that they're under. So therefore, we should give them out through bankruptcy. But I just think it's funny that Democrats have completely avoided that issue of bringing in student loans into the fold of bankruptcy. And I'm not sure how difficult that would be. But as far as, or I'm not sure how even retroactive you can make that. I'm sure all these questions get very complicated legally. But as far as the president having power to do this, like I would say no, just because the amount of just the breadth of it. I want to look into it more, but I'm sure it's a complicated question.
So I'm going to disagree. I'm going to kind of disagree right there, because I think there's a question of interpretation, right? Because we're talking about an executive agency, meaning that it was created by enabling statute, meaning the Congress had to delegate power to this agency to create it, right? So the question would be, what did that enabling statute say when Congress delegated that power to the executive branch to give their power away to the executive branch, right? So it's not like, the question is not, does this agency have this power? Congress gave the agency this power. That's why the agency exists. And I think it'll be a question of interpretation of that enabling statute. And I think when you look at the fact that, we have paused student loan, payments, I think that have shown that interpretation of enabling statute has said that that agency has that power that was given to them by Congress to pause payments. And in the same way, you make that same argument that, you can forgive payments also, right?
So just to that point, I would say when we're talking about interpretation, I think we need to remember as well, the current court has shown us that they have a certain agenda. And in the past year, I think
all courts have agendas. Sorry, not to cut you off. It's not a this court issue. Like all courts have agendas.
I'm referring to sort of this court's agenda to be specific there. But I think it was back in January. I think Justice Gorsuch cited the major questions doctrine, which is sort of being reinvented by the current court to effectively attack. To your point earlier, Mike, effectively attack this. Chevron deference and this ability of executive agencies to take a somewhat ambiguous statute and run with it in order to make large changes through policy. This is how they shut down President Biden's attempt to require everyone to be vaccinated in the country through the major questions doctrines, basically saying, listen, this is a huge change. This stands to, spend a lot of money. It spends to make a large difference in how the government's going to run. This is something that we're not going to say Congress gave the ability to make that decision to the agency. That's something so major that it has to go back to Congress. And you can't just say, even on Chevron deference, even though this is the expert agency, this agency can make that decision. It's got to go back to Congress. So if we start having to rely on interpretation of the statute, and we also recognize how many billions of dollars is student loan forgiveness, even if it's only $10,000, $20,000, many of us know how much larger the student loan debt can end up being. But even if it's only that, for all the students who have that, that's going to be billions and billions of dollars. That's probably something that this court would say, that's a major question. You can't do that by yourself. You got to send it back to Congress, and we're just not letting the executive branch make that decision by itself.
Well, the question would be, is that language that ambiguous, right? Well, because when you pause the payments, you're really forgiving a lot of money in interest. Right. So by every pause,
there's still a big difference between pausing and forgiving.
No, but it's still billions of dollars.
What language are we talking about? Like,
I want to intervene a little bit, because specifically we're talking about authority that was given to Biden. Jerry was alluding to it, but let's be specific. This is the Emergency Powers Act we're talking about. The Emergency Powers Act.
It's also the HEROES Act as well.
Right,
Mike, not just the Emergency Powers Act.
But I bring
go ahead.
Go ahead.
To me, at least, I think the litigation doesn't make much sense, because if this attorney was on PSLF, then he'd still have to pay taxes on the loans he still owed once it all got forgiven, which would invariably be much higher, thanks to opting out of his $10,000 to $20,000 of student loan forgiveness. So when we come to legal questions that the court has to consider, perceived harm versus actual harm is one of them. I just don't think that, what he is saying actually outweighs the harm he would face, the financial harm, which is his big argument he would face. Now, of course, we know that that the federal judiciary as a whole has become very right-leaning very quickly and is much more outcome determinative than, reading the facts and letting the conclusions fall where they may. But, that's why public opinion is also very important. We've seen how Democrats have turned the tide because they finally realized they needed to run on abortion and not away from it. So we need to see that effort from party leadership to say, Republicans are trying to put America's students $20,000 in debt. What are you going to do about it in November? It ties into Democrats being, salespeople for themselves. But as a whole, I don't think this litigation makes much sense. But what I think about this litigation versus what the District of Indiana thinks about this litigation are two different things, and that's ultimately what's going to be what settles it.
The reason why I brought up the reason why I brought up the Emergency Powers Act. Think back to 2019. In 2019, you had Donald Trump using that same act from 1976 to declare a national emergency to secure funding that Congress had expressly denied for the construction of a wall along the southern border. And before that declaration, most Americans were unaware. They were unaware that a vast set of laws gives the president greatly enhanced powers during emergencies. And when you look at the act, what does the act say? It says, with respect to acts of Congress authorizing the exercise during the period of a national emergency of any special or extraordinary power, the president is authorized to declare such national emergency. Such proclamation shall immediately be transmitted to the Congress and published in the Federal Register. Now, listen, the question is whether or not, in my view, the president articulated enough, I guess, had a reasonable enough belief that there was a national emergency. We're talking about COVID-19. And Jerry talked about it a little bit earlier. The student loan payments were delayed and delayed and delayed more after more, until it got to the point where we're now at the final pause, correct? And so that coupled with the economic fallout of COVID-19, coupled with the fact that you're having a huge amount of students being unable to pay their loans on time because, for whatever reason, there's been a large season of high unemployment before we started to see a rebound, right? So all of these things could, add to the totality of the circumstances for any presidential lawyer to say, well, listen, the president was fully within his jurisdiction or fully within his authority or right to declare that there was a national emergency as it pertains to student loan debt, knowing that this was going to just metastasize into something even worse than we ever experienced. And therefore, he found it necessary to forgive a portion of the debt so that people have an easier time to pay off those loans. I think that's a stronger argument than the Trump administration's attempt to use that same piece of legislation to justify a border wall that nobody needed, nobody called for until he made a campaign promise in 2015.
I would have to disagree with you.
Say the exact same thing, Mike, actually.
And one of them is about national security, another one's about financial stability, and one of them's about non-citizens freely coming into a country using resources, it's about securing a border for a nation, which is, to me, it just seems like the reverse of your statement would be true.
But the fact that the Pew Research Center said that we had the lowest amount of immigrants coming from the southern border since 1971, the Nixon administration. So Nixon didn't declare it a national emergency. Ford didn't. Reagan didn't. Carter didn't. Bush the father didn't. Obama didn't. Clinton didn't. Bush didn't. So it's like, what determines at that point whether the immigrant crisis is a national emergency? Is it the politics of the current incumbent? Because we can't disagree on the fact that COVID-19 was a national emergency and there was an economic fallout from that national emergency.
But at that point, I think that also speaks to why the pausing would be different than forgiveness in some people's minds. If you pause it during the national emergency of COVID, where the whole economy just kind of stopped, obviously it kept chugging along, but we remember it was a huge imposition on everyone's ability to make any kind of money. For that 2-year period, pausing things, or I guess 1.5 years after Biden came into office, pausing things during that period, that's one thing. I can definitely see the argument on the other side of now fully forgiving. That's a completely different ballgame that people have started.
That's over $1 trillion.
I disagree,
I
actually.
definitely see that argument being made differently.
I disagree because the act of forgiving, I would say, going off of my own personal experience, I am greatly impacted. My aspirations are impacted by the debt that I have collected by trying to get these degrees. So, with the aspect of inflation and recession looming over us, the emergency would constitute the debt weighing over the students like me who can't make a living because their degree is being held up because of this debt, and there's other factors.
So what do you mean by degree being held up because of the debt?
I won't get into that, but
as far as I know, people get.
I just want to say, I fully agree with you. I think that is actually legitimately. I'm just saying, I can
40% of borrowers actually, which is what Tia is mentioning. 40% of borrowers actually did not finish their degree program, so they're saddled with the degree, but not with the financial burden of the degree, but not the higher earning potential that the degree is supposed to bring.
I would agree.
A huge part of the conversation has to be about accountability for individuals getting these degrees. Like we can't act like that an individual making a choice to take on huge financial burden and
But is it really a choice though? Because we're given this idea that you have to better yourself to get a well-paying job.
This student loan forgiveness is just a payoff from the Democratic Party to its foot soldiers, to kids that they go to.
Everyone is affected by student debt, Republicans alike. The very lawyer who is bringing this to court probably has some sort of debt that is affecting him, but he just doesn't like the political implications that the gains that Democrats might get from.
It's not just academic students either. Vocational students on average graduate $20,000 in debt.
They tell us. I mean, I got $20,000 because of this, I have $20,000 in debt that will be wiped out if I apply through this program. And, with the aspects of, they tell you blue collar jobs aren't really an option for some people. They don't make it seem like an option. It's in our minds, in our society, is you need to go to college and you need to get a degree so you can get a well-paying job. And so many people feel forced into this type of debt.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I kind of disagree with Zach, because we're not just being forgiven $10,000, right? Conceptually, Trump forgave a lot of money, a lot of student loan debt for us by pausing, right? Because when pausing, the payments, you're saving so much money off of the interest, right? So in order for Trump to make that decision to pause and to say that we have the authority within this statute to pause payments, therefore forgiving really student loan debt at that time. So like conceptually, there's no difference between the pausing and forgiveness now. And so when you are interpreting that statute, I think the argument is going to be like, if there is constitutional authority to pause the payments, therefore forgiving these interest payments, it follows that you have the same authority on that same exact interpretation to forgive straight up a certain amount of money. Right? So there's no difference between the forgiveness and the pausation.
But the statute Mike just read was about emergency. The pausing was done during emergency. The emergency is pretty much over. So now you're trying to increase what you're doing under the emergency. There is no emergency anymore.
This as an economical emergency because
there's so many economic that's such a stretch to use emergency powers. Like I guess that's what we're really disagreeing on. Because
yeah, that's fine. But our generation, this is really a reparation for millennial and Gen Z generation because of the way that because the way that we are being crushed with debt in comparison to boomers and busters, it's affecting our ability to earn. It's affecting how we get housing, loans. You guys know you're when you sit for the bar and having to explain the debt that you have, it affects your professional life as well. So it's not. Depending on what you consider emergency, my debt to income ratio is an emergency to me. I don't know about you, but it's an emergency to me.
And I think that's the issue, though, is because I think you're very right that is something that could be classified as emergency. But the question is, Ish, obviously, he disagrees on that. How many other people disagree on that? And what actually qualifies as emergency? What I'm saying is I think that there is probably going to be, especially if that's going to go to the courts, if it keeps going, there's going to be a distinction made, I think, between the absolute, like no one could argue that in 2020 there was not a just bona fide emergency. No one could, people did, but no one could possibly legitimately argue that the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 was not a bona fide, never before seen emergency. I 100% see how, when this keeps going, people are going to probably convincingly to many people make the argument that student loan debt is not an emergency. Frankly,
one last thing, Mike,
is an emergency.
I think people are forgetting when the Trump administration
being made that it's not.
When the Trump administration made this decision to pause, student loan payments, they didn't say the only reason we have this power is through this emergency act. Right. They also pointed to the enabling statute and said that we have this power within this executive branch, this executive agency to do this. Right. So it wasn't just, we can only do this because we have declared emergency. Right. That was part of it. But they also pointed to this enabling statute and said that we have the power that was given to us through this statute. Right. So it doesn't matter if it's emergency or not. Right. Like that interpretation is that the executive branch has that power. In emergency or outside of emergency.
The facts of being under the federal, executive purview, I think that's correct.
Right. So if we're going to forgive these student loans, should we stop allowing the federal government to subsidize unprofitable degrees? So just so a student can come along later and play woe is me? Because if a student wants to...
What is an unprofitable degree, right? We watched some of this pandemic and we understand that. We need sociologists. It's not a sexy, big money degree, but we need sociologists. And moreover, Most of us on this platform all have profitable degrees,
no,
but we are all settled down by debt. I did
we should
everything
decide
right.
what we
I
need.
went
Our
to college,
politicians
I went to
decide
law
what we
school,
need.
I got the degree, and I still have the $148,000 mortgage,
The point
you
I was
know,
about to make is a very
anchoring
cogent
me
one. It's
around.
that
But there is
should
no
we
really
allow
such
people
thing
to
as an
compete?
unprofitable degree because we don't simply go to
It was a
school
question.
to
It must
make
have been a
money,
rhetorical
that, or
question.
at
Like
least
you
that never
asked me
should have been
you
the
asked me the
purpose
question
of
when I'm on
higher
the bias
education,
side.
right?
You asked me a
We
question
need
when
the
I was on
arts,
the
right?
bias
Every
side.
time you
I think
complain about how new
barely
singers
here.
can't
I
sing,
think
it's
we
because
should.
we're not funding the arts. We need the arts. We need sociologists.
We have a
We need
democracy,
people who
Nate.
study
We have
women's
we
and
have a
gender
democracy,
studies. We need
and we
all
have
of that for a healthy
we
and
have
functioning
free market.
society.
We don't.
Especially when you consider that people who get these degrees in one thing don't always get graduate degrees in another. So it's
what
not
do you?
just profitable
Let's
versus
just make our
unprofitable
argument
degrees.
turn. Your argument is
Now,
we
if
should
you can argue that
subsidize.
the
We
federal
should
government never
subsidize
should have
unprofitable
subsidized higher
degrees.
education with
If
loans and they
I
should
was
have
to
pushed
exercise
more
your
grants
argument, it
instead,
would be
that is a
we
different
have
argument
Okay,
entirely. And I
let's
agree
do
that we
both sides.
never should have used loans to subsidize higher education. It always should have been grants.
All right,
But that's
Ishmael.
not what we're talking about.
you asked me a question. I guess I'll answer it now. But how do we define unprofitable degrees? It's about degrees that if a person takes on $200,000 for a theology degree and there's no reasonable reason why he thinks he can pay that off to maturity, should we allow the government to subsidize? And what I mean government, I mean the rest of society. Should your tax dollars go up just because, in your words, we need theologists, we need artists? Maybe so, but let's actually put that to the people who are going to pay for it. Let's not individually decide to let one president forgive student loans, but not even change the entire scheme that made people need this forgiveness. We're keeping the lunacy going while forgiving the loans, but letting people. If the debt is so crushing, let's stop crushing more people with the debt.
That goes against the basic freedoms of this country. How are you going to classify something?
No one's guaranteed education. Well, which freedom does it go against?
A sociologist that wants to get a doctorate degree, who knows how much money that's going to take, especially if they choose.
And if he can find a private source to fund that, God bless him. But why do the taxpayers have to back up his bad decision? Or
focusing on profit also destroys.
Education really a bad decision?
It could be if it's crushing someone in debt, right? Or no?
No, I don't believe education at the end of the day is a bad decision.
An emergency right now?
Overcharging for these degrees, you can see how much these degrees have costed, have gone up over the years in comparison for boomers. Back in the day, you could work minimum wage.
Let's take the facts as they are. I'm not trying to live in a fairy tale world.
The facts as they are is that we have a shortage of doctors and nurses in rural areas because the pay there does not justify the cost of the degree.
Yeah.
So when we focus only on profit, we are ignoring essential services. We need public defenders, but most people are not becoming public defenders, or at least the people who are best suited to become public defenders are not filling this essential service, this essential constitutional service even, because the pay you get as a public defender is nowhere near the pay you could get as a first-year associate arguing in favor of the credit card companies. So because we are focusing on profit, if we say, your loans are only forgiven at this point, only if you got a profitable degree that tells people, I need to work for it tells people I need to ignore the societal functions because I need to be able to justify the cost. I need to only work at the biggest and the fanciest hospitals because if I work in a rural hospital, I'll never be able to afford anything.
So can I interject for a second? So I believe that what needs to follow up with this loan forgiveness is basic legislation, like the first 2 years, associates being given to citizens, free education up until your associate's degree. That would take away a lot of the unreasonable degrees that Ishmael is talking about, because at the end of the day, it reduces the debt ratio that we have by only having to pay for 2 years. Ishmael, is that something that you think would affect?
No, absolutely not, because maybe. But what I'm saying is that the government should stop subsidizing should stop subsidizing an economically imprudent decision. If we told people to go find private funding for your education, then We have law schools ranked 200 in the country that are charged the same much as the ones ranked number 1. And that's because they don't have to prove the product that they produce. They don't have to prove that the degree that they're charging someone $200,000 for is actually worth that. But they would have to prove that if they were getting funding that wasn't subsidized by the federal government. This subsidization is the reason tuitions have gone up. In previous generations, subsidizing this amount of unprofitable degrees or crushing degrees, like degrees that like you say, like how can these people, even if they drop out, they can't afford to even pay it off. So why even let them get in that position in the first place? The only reason they can get in that position in the first place is because the public tax dollars have said that we will subsidize this decision. We don't care if it's going to, bury you in debt. But we're going to let you do that because of some, fantastical idea of education.
Yeah, I agree.
I gotta jump in here. I'm sorry. That kind of thinking is what keeps people who start from low socioeconomic areas from getting degrees to begin with, regardless of what the degree is. If it's all up to private people making, a private bank, a private lender making the decision, oh, do I want to invest in this? Not making that education available to others. And we can talk about the issue of the fact that there's no public funding for higher education anyway, as it is, even though the reason it was up till 12th grade historically was because that's all you really needed to have some kind of career, and you could get something else than if you went to college later. Now, in the United States, you probably need that college degree at the very least, but that's beside the point.
Blue-collar jobs are doing very well.
Many jobs in the United States require at least a college degree at this point. It is not the percentage that it was in the 50s, 60s, 70s that you can have just
even
a high school.
Blue-collar graduates are racking up debt for the vocational programs too.
Nowhere near the amount as these 4 years.
But also, the whole reason, one of the great things that was done in this country in the last 100 years was that access to higher education for either people who just wanted it, people who needed it, for the ability to have that kind of chances at social mobility was the ability to, even if you were not a safe bet for a lender, to get that money to go to a higher education. A lot of people would not be able to get that higher degree that they would be more deserving of anybody else then, unless they had public funding. Because to be perfectly frank, if you're from a lower socioeconomic background, the chances of you getting a private loan to go to a higher education are very low. People don't want to make that bet because they don't think they're going to get their money back.
I feel like most people,
I think you made a good point about
both sides of their mouth on this issue. We want to acknowledge that it's some soul-crushing national emergency, but at the same time, let's keep it going. Yeah. Explain that logic to me, please. Someone.
It's predatorial. It's really at this point, it's getting kind of predatorial, right? But I agree, kind of both sides here, and I think Zach made a great point that decades ago we made a decision that as society it was important that we made K through 12 accessible to everybody, because it was important for us to have a functional society for people to be at least educated up to the 12th grade. Now it sounds like that, in modern day, that it's important for society to be educated up to the college level, because you can't get a job unless you are, have that 4-year degree. So the conversation begins, well,
not true.
How about we use K to 12,
but the
K to 16, you make that
percentage
4-year degree.
We're not a manufacturing country anymore.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But what I'm saying is,
electrician, flight attendants, everywhere I go, there's a help.
There are 330
argument goes directly
against. We cannot have 300 million carpenters. That's not going to be a sustainable economy.
Your argument goes directly against someone's aspirations and dreams. Was it not your dream to become a lawyer? Your skills and your aspirations.
It was. I made a business decision.
Do you consider your degree to be, impractical because you had the dream to become a lawyer?
I wouldn't have said someone was wrong for saying, hey, you have the right to have your dream, and I pray you find a way to make it, but I don't think that we should subsidize that dream by the entire taxpayers' dollars, because it may not be, because maybe I have bad credit, or maybe I've had a previous dream that flunked out. So this type of very puffery language that makes it seem like this is all sunshine and good. The initial thing is, we all recognize that the student debt crisis is a crisis. It's crushing people. You said yourself that you think it should be a national emergency. Well, if something led to a national emergency that's negative, why are you arguing to keep it going? Is my only question.
It's not.
Somebody might have a dream to have a Bentley, but have a 500 credit score.
Society.
But the government shouldn't give everybody a Bentley because,
right,
for your dreams.
You have universities out here just lining their pockets because they know it's coming from public money.
No, I mean public universities, degrees in public, it's legislation, I feel, that can back up what you're saying, and not you're just giving an umbrella statement of subsidizing these impractical degrees, but making public universities the degrees free, so that, you know, the difference of choosing a public university versus a private university will drastically impact the debt that you incur. You know, the associate degree is becoming available to everyone. I know early college is becoming a thing in high schools now. That's greatly reducing the debt that we impact. It's not necessarily subsidizing impractical degrees. It's that America is way behind on how we view education.
And we may be subsidizing party years as well. We're not even talking about that. We may just be subsidizing for people to get away from their home and just go have a college experience, which is why are we giving 18-year-olds the authority to take on such crushing?
I think we can make 4-year colleges free, and then, you know, if you want to go to graduate school, you have to pay on your own dime. You go to law school, you pay on your own dime, right? You know, but I think at this point we have realized that it is necessary to extend, you know, the idea of the past of we need K through 12 education for everybody has that accessibility. I think now we're looking at, well, you probably need more of a college education to function within society. If that's the case, then we can look at making that free.
We don't need no more political
it's also
scientists.
important.
We don't need no more sociologists. We don't need we need certain.
We need plenty of sociologists. You just went through a 2-year pandemic that killed 600,000 people. We need to understand exactly who was affected and how. But you're right, Ishmael, that student loan forgiveness can't be the only step. We need more than just that. We need education reform at the highest levels. We need to move away from subsidizing education with loans and move towards more of a grant-focused mindset, because you're right, Zach. The federal government was the only entity back in the 60s when the Higher Education Act was written that was willing to lend large sums of money to people with no employment history and no credit history and a low earning potential. And it was an investment in our own society that we were making. And, you know, we need to keep making that investment in our society. We need to invest in students just as much as we invest in Elon Musk, in Jeff Bezos going to space, just as much as we invest in Elon Musk's death traps, just as much as we as a society invest in the federal government, you know, attempting coups all over the world. We need to invest in our students as well. It makes no sense that we should have. The reason empires fall all over the world is because they have trillions for war and pennies for everybody else.
Yeah, and the truth is, undergrad degree today is like a high school diploma was 20 years ago. You can get a high school undergrad degree today, and it's not going to redo much for you. It's almost a ticket to graduate school, professional school at this point, right?
And
you come out with a degree. There's really much you can't.
I want to say one last thing quick to Ishmael. If you're, you know, targeting these certain degrees because these certain degrees are, you know, the degree level aren't, you know,
profitable
makers, are you going to go back into like public school and actually go back and start saying, okay, music class is gone, art class is gone?
No, absolutely not.
What makes it effectively that much different?
The cost. The cost to the public.
You think it doesn't cost the public when
not nearly as much as higher?
Have you seen doing that?
No, not nearly. Do you think it costs as much to run a music class as it does to give someone $200,000 to go to whatever university they may want to go to?
Well, you need to train the music teacher, and you need to provide them with instruments and, you know, the infrastructure necessary to teach a music class, and that money does add up. But it's important to mention to your point.
You're also going by the current price tag of a private institution for that music degree, as opposed to the price tag of a public institution for a music degree.
The U.S. loan program doesn't make that distinction, so I don't. They both get federal money, just the same.
I think you have to look at
just the same, but they both get federal money.
But look, guys, I think now you have
to I would really
like a high school diploma, where it doesn't matter what you study your 11th or 12th grade year. If you took extra classes, you wasn't getting a high school diploma to get like a job, right? It was like, this is your education to better yourself, to get to the next level. So undergrad, it doesn't matter if you studying sociology or whatever. We look at it as this is an essential, you know, part of our education from K to 16. You know, but it is not.
There are undergrad degrees where you can go straight into the workforce. Let you get a computer science degree.
You're talking about high school diploma. Well, high school diploma.
But you're saying bachelor degrees are now basically a stepping stone to get to graduate degrees, and that's not necessarily the case. If you
be honest, there's people with master's degrees and doctorates that
why did they choose that degree? Did they do their research and know that they weren't going to have a job?
Okay, we do need to find the plane.
So I would just like to mention, like what Tia said, that
How smart are
Joe
they?
Biden's signature
All right,
legislation,
Nate will have the
the
last
Build
word.
Back Better Act, would have made community college free at the point of sale, right? And that's part of why it's so important to not just have, impassioned discussions like this, but also to, take ownership of what's happening in your community and be that investor, be that shareholder in our society, and look into the candidates who are running to represent you and, vote for the people who you like, especially as we head into the closing stage of the midterm season. So if you really want this education reform and all of that, you have to look into the candidates around you, and not just at the top of the ballot either. The most important power you have as it relates to education is to elect the members of the Board of Education in your communities. So especially look into those candidates as well.
Okay,
Student loan
I think
bankrupt. That's all I want to say. I'm for that.
okay.
This is my favorite show, Mike. My favorite.
let me thank you each for what you brought to the discussion tonight. This was an impassioned, like Nate mentioned, an impassioned discussion. It's discussions like these that make me remember why I even started this platform. But I do want to just echo what Nate had mentioned. Education, of course, is an investment, right? And so the one thing we didn't talk about, unfortunately, was the fact that it actually is detrimental to the United States. This student loan debt crisis that we've been going back and forth about actually cost the United States $321 billion, right? And so if we were this is just to put it in perspective, for those fiscal hawks out there who may be tuning in. But I do want to thank you, Tia Toombs, Zach Tolan, Ishmael, Nate, Jerry. This was a very colorful, very lively, very engaging discussion. This is one discussion I don't think you can snooze on. I thoroughly enjoyed the diversity of thought that you guys brought to the program tonight. We did go over a little bit, and we didn't talk about everything that we set out to in the agenda, but nevertheless, this was a very, very thoughtful discussion, I thought. Thank you guys for tuning in to episode 76. Episode 76 of Political Mike. I just want to encourage the viewers, like I do every week, to refrain from sketchy sources of news and information and challenge the sources of news that you do plug into. We're getting closer and closer. We're 6 weeks away from this election. And we've heard many times on this platform and other platforms that this election should not be taken for granted. Student loan debt is just one reason, right? The hurricane crisis was another. We've got a myriad of reasons why we need to make sure that we're part of the process and a part of the solution. Thank you guys so much for what you brought tonight. Thank you for dedicating your busy time from your busy schedules to be on here tonight. That concludes episode 76 of the Political Mike. Thanks for tuning in.